Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on the show today. Welcome to your Friday edition. It's the one day where around the state it's going to be raining, and the rest of the week it's been beautiful. Sunny skies, warm weather set for Saturday, 4 o'clock kickoff. Fox broadcast, Jason Benetti, Brock Heward again on the call. This will be their third time calling this game. Oregon, obviously in the college football playoff hunt, number 6 in the country. They've won 8 games in a row. Huskies are in the top 25 at number 25 with a 7-2 record, 4-2. I guess they're technically still in the Pac-12 championship race here. Things could get crazy and things could maybe fall their way to get in. So, it's a rivalry week. It's a staff that's embracing the rivalry week, and there's a lot on the line for both teams in this football game. It's exactly what we would want for a November football game. Everything is on the table for both teams.
And especially in this rivalry, where very rarely have we been able to say that. You just think, I was just looking through I use Winsipedia to track the head-to-head matchups in these kind of series. There haven't been very many games where it's been played this time of year where both teams are actually like kind of still fully in the hunt to make a run at a division title in the past, and obviously now at the conference championship. And as Matt said, Washington is technically still alive, but they'd have to win out. They'd have to hope Oregon loses again. They'd have to hope a couple other teams lose multiple times, which could happen. It's kind of, I'm trying to think through how this would all work out. I guess Oregon beats Utah, but loses to Oregon State, and then Utah. I don't even know what the tiebreaker would be. It's like I'm running through my brain. I think Washington probably has like a 2% chance of making it. I think it's very slim, but they're still in it. And as we said, this is a rivalry which, like, I was running through it. There's been, of the last 17 games, Oregon's won 15, and the 2 games Washington won were total ass kicks on Washington's side, and the first 11 that Oregon won in the series were total ass kicks on Oregon's side. The last 3 games have all been pretty close. Oregon's won them all by 10 points or fewer. This feels like a game that should be closer to the 10 points or fewer range than the total ass kick range that we saw for most of the century in this head-to-head series. So I'm excited for it. I think we're going to get into some of the matchups and why it could be really competitive. I think Oregon has a team that is totally firing on all cylinders right now. I don't know if you can quite say the same thing about Washington. If you just kind of look at the way their season's played out, it seems like they may have played their best football a little bit over a month and a half ago. At the same time, can't take them lightly, and their strengths, and we'll get into some of that, kind of go up against some of Oregon's biggest weaknesses.
Yeah, I mean, we might as well just jump into that right now, just because. Yeah, I don't have too much else to add to it. It's rivalry week. This is a big game for both teams. Despite Washington not having the highest percentage of winning the conference, it's still there. Oregon, TJ Bass said they don't need the extra motivation of Washington week. They know what they're fighting for every single day that they step out on the field. And that's a college football playoff berth. That's a Pac-12 championship game. Each team has a lot fighting for, and then it just happens to be rivalry week. So I think we should just dive right into what Oregon doesn't do well, or what Washington does do well, what Washington doesn't do well, and all that.
Yeah, I think it starts with Michael Penix at quarterback. He's certainly turned himself into one of the premier quarterbacks in the country. And that, I don't know if that was necessarily expected. Jared wrote a story on DuckTerritory.com, kind of just looking about, this quarterback matchup is the storylines are kind of similar. Both guys weren't really highly regarded players when they transferred here and have turned into superstars. And it's going to be interesting to see just how Oregon defends Penix, because he's by far, I think, the best quarterback Oregon has faced to date this season from a statistical standpoint, for sure. But then beyond that, Stetson Bennett maybe, but he's got way better talent around him than Penix does. Hall at BYU maybe, but
DTR
would be another one. He's nowhere near the passer, but Penix is nowhere near the runner of DTR. So this is, I think this is the fascinating matchup. This is the biggest matchup of how does Oregon defend UW's passing game, and in particular Penix, who's been pretty darn impressive this season for the Huskies.
Yeah, this is a throw the ball every down kind of offense that Oregon's facing. Like legitimately, they average 45 passes per game. That's their average. That's not like a season high. That's a ton. And Penix is somebody who is mobile, but not inclined to run the football and tuck it and go. He'll go through his reads. Yeah. He'll find the way to find open receivers, or he'll get rid of the football, or he'll take a short. He has like no rushing yards this season. I'm just saying, like, sometimes you look at what
I was just gonna say that he's got nothing. This is not somebody who runs the football. This is maybe like I'll scramble for 2 or 3 yards. This is not an 18-yard scramble.
And I think some of that has to do with the injury history, having his last 3 seasons ended, I believe, with season-ending injuries, which is just really tough. I was going to say break, but that's the wrong word. But just a really bad, unfortunate way his career has gone to this point. And always been a pretty talented guy. I mean, like, you think about how he was, I think it was in the 2020 at Indiana, and even the year before in 2019, like the stats were really impressive before the injury, but he could never play more than 5, 6 games before being shelved for the season. He's now had a full season of staying healthy, and you're seeing what's happened. And this is a really talented offense around him. This is a offensive coaching staff led by Kalen DeBoer, the head coach, who is an offensive-minded coach that know what they're doing with this type of quarterback talent. And remember, it was not long ago that Jake Haener, the Fresno State quarterback, was also set to be on this team, or expected to potentially be on this team. That didn't play out, and I think there was a moment where people in the conference were kind of celebrating that fact, going like, well, at least Haener's not in the conference. Well, Penix has probably been at least as good, maybe probably a little better than what you would have gotten out of Haener in this offense. Obviously, Haener would have had a little more familiarity, but he's a veteran guy, and he's surrounded by some really talented receivers. Like, I think talking with Bennett Williams, the comparison is the Arizona offense in terms of the receiver talent, in terms of the style of play, in terms of a little bit of the quarterback. And I think you can argue with pretty good, like, you can defend the argument, I should say, of like Washington has the best receivers Oregon's played in Pac-12 play. Adunze and McMillan.
I think they are.
Both big-time recruits.
Giles Jackson, too, another good third wide receiver.
Well, Jalen Polk is statistically their third. Jackson was a guy that was also a highly regarded recruit. It's a guy that Oregon recruited pretty heavily, but like, it's a really talented group, and Oregon did a great job in Tucson. We have to know, like, that was the game. Remember, we were all predicting like, oh, this could be a really close game. I might not have picked them to cover. If I did, it was like the slimmest of margins. I can't remember. It was like right in the fence, and then they just blasted them. I don't think that will be the way this goes. I think it's possible Oregon wins big, but I'm also just very wary of the fact that, like, this is a skill position group that will really challenge Oregon on the outside. And we've seen kind of mixed results this year with that. And the last 2 games aren't super impressive, and particularly just getting beaten deep. And I will acknowledge that I had thought it was Steve Stevens' fault on the 81 yards pass. Bennett Williams took accountability for that yesterday, said it was his fault. He blew the coverage, and really talked about the way that they can't have a coverage bust like that take place again this week, because I think Washington's guys are talented enough that you play them straight up, you play your best, they're still going to win some downs. If you make mistakes like that, that's where you really potentially get this thing interesting. So it's going to be a huge test for a secondary. It's going to be really, really interesting to see how they match up here and kind of how they hold their own. I guess I'm optimistic about, maybe forcing some turnovers and making things not like just a complete bloodletting, but I also think you have to look at this pass offense from Washington and give them a lot of respect.
Absolutely, you need to give them a lot of respect. I watched a lot of Washington highlights this morning and then last night. This is as close to an air raid offense as we have probably in the Pac-12 since Mike Leach's Washington State teams. They're, like Erik mentioned, they're throwing 45 times a game. on average. It's a ridiculous number. Penix has hit over 50 throws in a game multiple times this season. He's basically like a long reliever out there on the football field. It's absurd how many times he throws a football. But I watched a lot of the Cal game because I thought that Cal's defense, despite Oregon putting up more than 40 points, I thought they had some good moments against Oregon's offense that is one of the best in the country. And they had their spots against Washington's offense as well, but it just felt like death by 1,000 paper cuts with how Washington is in their game plan. There's a lot of short yards, 4 to 8 yards a pass, basically using it as their running game. They're like, okay, well, on first down we could run for 3 or 4 yards, but we'll just pass and maybe we'll get 6 because somebody breaks a tackle. It's very similar to how, like Erik was saying, like how Arizona runs their offense, where Oregon's pass defense did a really good job against Arizona and held them to one of the worst games of the season by them. It's just going to be such an interesting storyline for this week because I'm not 100% sure what it is that Oregon needs to do to stop this, because it's just going to be, like I said, like death by 1,000 paper cuts. There are going to be times where they do really well. Oregon does really well in deep coverage, but just 2 passes later, it'll be like 2 4-yard out routes to the sideline. It'll be 3rd and 2 instead of 3rd and 8, 3rd and 6, something like that. It's just a really good overall offense. Michael Penix has complete command of it. Very familiar with Kalen DeBoer, his offensive philosophy. He's turned into one of the best quarterbacks in the country, really, and he leads the country in so many interesting passing stats, so many good passing stats that you want your quarterback to lead in. I think the only thing that Oregon has going for them is how miserable Washington's run offense is and how good Oregon's rush defense is. But I think Washington probably will quickly abandon any attempts at running the football against Oregon's defense after, I don't know, maybe a quarter or two.
I think Oregon's best defense in this game is going to be its offense. And
probably.
And basically, I don't know if we're necessarily going to see Oregon go 14J and try and run 12 straight run plays every single time they have the football, but it's definitely try and get out by a 2-score lead and then chew up the clock and, take your shots downfield when they present themselves, but don't try and just sling it around like crazy up 14 or more and, present opportunities where the clock is just not continuously tick, 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 tick. I think Oregon's best defense will be its offense. Very similar to what happened against UCLA, because field goals in this game are going to be like punts, I feel like, where if you're having to settle for a field goal, it's more than likely going to feel like you failed, even though you put 3 points on the board, because both these offenses are really good. I don't think either defense is elite. I don't think I would shade to Oregon having the better defense, but I don't think that's like this astronomically wide margin either between these two teams. UW certainly can't stop the run. Oregon is a little bit better there. But that pass, UW doesn't run the ball. Like Jared said, like they're not an excessively running team. They throw the ball a ton. And so I just look at this as the team that makes the most mistakes offensively, whether that's a 3rd down drop and they have to punt, or whether that's a 3rd and medium that they don't convert on the ground and they have to take a field goal, that's going to be a mistake. That's going to be almost the same as punting the football or turning the ball over when you have to, leave 4 points off the board because you're taking field goals.
I think Oregon's defensive philosophy will be very similar to what it's been during this run, which is don't give up the deep shots, but understand that in the red zone, they've been, for the most part, pretty darn good at converting those to field goals, as much as Matt said, put you at a deficit in a game where we think a lot of points will be scored, forcing turnovers, forcing, 4 turnovers on downs. We saw that twice in Boulder. We saw that a little bit in other games earlier this season. So, I think, Jared outlined it properly of their commitment to the pass. If you keep everything in front of you, which they couldn't do against Georgia, but I think they've done a better job of late, and you can force Washington to move the ball with sustained drives as opposed to explosive drives, that's going to give you, I think, the best chance in this game to keep Washington from maybe like holding serve, because I do think Oregon's going to score in this game. And I think this might be a game where, like as Matt said, it might be follow a little bit of a similar roadmap for Oregon to win as the UCLA game, where UCLA is going to gain its yards. UCLA put up some big yard figures in that game, a lot on the ground. DTR got his through the air. I think he had like 266 or something. But a lot of their drives resulted in field goals. And at a certain point in the game, you couldn't continue kicking those field goals because it was a losing proposition to do so. And you ended up going for it. Oregon won a couple of those, lost a couple of those, and because of that, was able to pull away. So I do think that's, to me, is kind of the defensive formula of, hey, we might give up 5 yards on a couple of passes. We might give up 20 on a couple of others. We might let them move the ball down the field. But if you can just kind of hold serve in the red zone, maybe go 50-50 in terms of forcing field goals to touchdown rate, I think you're going to put yourself in a pretty good position to win, because I do think this is a game where it's like probably the team who scores in the mid 40s is going to win. And if you can hold Washington out of the end zone with regularity, that's where this game changes to me.
Yeah, the bend don't break philosophy is probably Oregon's best bet, because regardless of what defense you have, Washington's still going to pass for around 300 yards. They passed for almost 300 yards, 298 against Oregon State last week, and that was in just like a terrible rainstorm. The wind, it was rainy, but they still almost threw for 300 yards. Oregon's defense has been really good in the red zone, and I think that really goes into the fact of how much they've been able to win this season, because teams haven't necessarily ran into a lot of hardship going down the field. So when they get into the red zone, they get inside the 20, where Oregon's defense starts to at least close some gaps. The field isn't as open, and then Oregon's defense is able to do better there. And I think, like you guys both mentioned, how Oregon performed against UCLA and holding them to field goals. I think that's going to be a major key to this game. I think it'll be a closer game. There's always a part of me that thinks like, yeah, it could be a blowout just because of how often Oregon scores the football, and if there's a couple turnovers or mistakes, like Matt said, from Washington's side, it could be a pretty significant margin in like the first half, let's say. But this Washington team, with how they throw the football, they're not usually taking shots like into double coverage and things like that. They're not really pushing the ball. They're not taking risks. They're looking. It's very similar to Oregon's offense. When the deep shot is there, they're taking it. But they'll look for the underneath route. They'll look for somebody right over the middle. They'll look for somebody in the flats. It's just built and designed to get yards. It's very, like I said earlier, it's very much air raid offense-esque. But if Oregon can take chances and maybe turn into a turnover and get an interception, something like that, that would really help them move the ball and keep their defense, frankly, off the field. But overall, just back to the original point, the long-winded answer of that bend don't break philosophy that they've implemented so often this year, it's going to continue on Saturday against Washington.
Real quick, defensively, Washington does have 4 guys in the top 14 in the conference in sacks this season.
Yeah.
Braylon Trice is 3rd in the league at 6.5, and right behind him is Jeremiah Martin with 6, and he's 4th. And then Voy Tunufi at 10 with 4, and then ZTF, another edge guy, at 3.5 with 14th in the conference. And then you go down the list again. There's 2 more guys. They've gotten a lot of sacks this season. Now, there's 2 ways to look at that. One, hey, they have statistically a lot of sacks. They've accomplished this in the game. You have to recognize it. You have to realize, hey, this is going to be something to look at. But when you then look at maybe the opponents that they've played, especially in conference, they haven't played any of the elite offensive lines. They've played Cal, who's given up the 2nd most sacks this season. Stanford, the 10th most sacks the 3rd most sacks this season. ASU, Arizona, Colorado. Those are all the bottom teams in the league. They haven't really faced elite offensive lines until the last couple of weeks. Oregon State was one, but Oregon State's not a team that wants to throw the football. They are a run-oriented team. And then the other one that they've played, is UCLA, and they lost that football game. This will be by far the most talented offensive line that Washington faces. But on the flip side, this will be one of the tougher matchups that Oregon will have in protecting Bo Nix, where if you walk out of this game with 0 sacks, I think that's it's already a pretty big accomplishment, but it's even more so against the opponent that Oregon's playing this weekend.
Yeah, Ryan Walk said this is the best front seven from a pass rush they've faced all season since Georgia.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, let me finish the
again.
sentence.
I was waiting for the Georgia. I thought that Walk would play into, hey, it's a rivalry week. These guys.
No. He said since Georgia. And Matt ran through some of the names there. Like Trice and Hunt or Martin are really talented guys on the outside, and ZTF has just been hurt so much during his career. It's really a shame. I think he's a really talented player. I think he's supposed to be good this week, but I think for Oregon, this will be a big test up front, and they've done. And the stats are incredible. I mean, 1 sack, and we're in mid-November. It's absolutely unbelievable that figure. And really, the 1 sack was like kind of a weird play, where I think Nix almost got back to line of scrimmage anyway. So I mean, they really haven't had a ton of situations where Nix has dropped back and he's even been close to being sacked, and he's thrown a couple away. He's obviously used his feet to escape a couple of times, more than a couple, but it'll be interesting to see how much of an impact this has, because I do think that's been one of the really kind of foundational pieces to Nix's success this season, is just the improvement of the offensive line playing in front of him, as opposed to what he played, at Auburn, where he was constantly under duress, where he was running for his life and having to make plays. His ability in this offense to have time back there, but also I think that the maturation of the quarterback of understanding, hey, when there isn't a great situation, let me move and find some space, because I think the sack stats are both offensive line, also quarterback recognition. He's really good in the pocket of acknowledging things, but we'll see how much of an impact that has, and we'll see how much of an impact Oregon on the ground is able to make. Washington defensively is second in the conference behind Oregon in rush yards allowed this season. They're 20th nationally in rush yards per carry allowed at about 3.4. Nobody's run for more than 200 yards on them this season. Charbonnet being the high rusher this year, I think he ran for about 125. Oregon will want to run the football. They will want to put the pressure on a Washington defense that is starting to play a little bit more like it did during the Chris Peterson era, where you had a front seven that made things happen. And obviously, I think the difference for this Washington team, as opposed to some of those other teams, was I don't think the secondary is anywhere near as strong right now as it has been at Washington. You look up and down NFL rosters right now, and Washington has a ton of guys that are playing at corner, at safety, and big time players in the NFL that were under Peterson, and Jimmy Lake as being a position coach and then a coordinator and then the head coach that kind of brought that group up. This year's team is devoid of a lot of that, but their front is much better. They're a lot better against the run than they have been in the past. I think Oregon's going to have some success here. I'm not really that concerned in terms of I don't think Oregon's going to be held to 3 yards per carry. I don't think Oregon will be held under 120 yards or something. But I do think this is going to be one of the bigger challenges, and that could have a compounding impact of, if Oregon gets slowed down a little on first and second, now you're looking at third downs that are a little bit more daunting for a Bo, and maybe that's where they're able to get the pass rush home against Nix, and he has to make some plays that lead to some mistakes. So I'm talking kind of like worst case for Oregon, but that's kind of the game plan or roadmap for Washington, is if they're able to stack up okay up front, get some pressure on the third downs, force third downs, that's where it becomes problematic, I think, for Oregon potentially. But I still contend this is going to be a game where a lot of points are scored, and Oregon will score its fair share of those points.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think this is going to be a game where just a lot of points are scored, just like what Erik said. I will say the sack numbers for Washington, while they are really good, 26 through 9 games, 8 of them came against Stanford in September, and then 5 of them came against Cal, and then 4 came against Arizona. They feast on the bottom feeders, like Matt mentioned. Like, these are not the best offensive lines in the country, but also not in the conference. And they feasted against them. And Oregon did the same thing, because I don't think Oregon's pass rush is that great. We've seen it not in existence. We've seen it come to existence against Washington State or Cal, but I think both teams are in similar boats. They are not good against the pass. They are pretty damn good against the run. They get a pass rush every once in a while. They have dudes who look like they could get a pass rush, like Braylon Trice, who has 9.5 tackles for loss this season, which leads Washington as a team. I expect Oregon to go after them in the running department. I think Oregon's going to try to run the ball and kind of just prove it to the rest of the Pac-12, and especially to Washington, that, hey, like, yeah, we may have switched our coach from a meathead who's a former offensive lineman who loves running the ball, who loves power football, to a guy who's going to do the exact same thing and would probably consider himself to also be a meathead. And I think that they're just going to, like Matt said, I don't know if they'll go 14J for an entire quarter or an entire half quarter like they did against BYU or UCLA. But I don't expect them to let their foot up off the gas in terms of the running game. I think they're going to try to stick it to them. I also think that Washington hasn't necessarily played the best rushing attack teams. Oregon State was the second highest yards or total yards on the ground this season against Washington after UCLA. But then, Arizona's not going to run it. Arizona State is bad, but Washington lost to them, so I don't know what to make of that. And then Cal, we all know, because Oregon just recently played them, not a great rushing the football team. And Oregon is. They got one of the best of offensive lines in the country. I think their offensive line is the best in the Pac-12. Washington is pretty good too, though. I will admit that. They're another one of those teams that's really good at pass block. I think they're just going to put the foot to the gas, pedal to the floor. They're going to try to establish the run early and often and try to take deep shots.
We've kind of done it organically without really saying it, but do we want to talk about keys to the game? I mean, I felt like we just rolled right through it organically on the show.
Well, I think we can get into injuries and then our predictions, because I think we've done a good job of establishing it. Like, I guess to summarize, like, I think Oregon needs to be able to run the football to set up the pass. Yep. And I think defensively, you have to try to extend the drives for Washington and not let them beat you deep over the top and then hopefully win in the red zone. Like, I think that's my summation of it. Those will be some of my keys on my 5-key story that you'll be reading later today.
Yeah, I don't think that there's too much else. I think that these teams are interestingly matched up. They seem like, I don't know, it seems like a lot of times in the Pac-12 with Oregon this season, they'll go against a team that has the better, does what Oregon can't do on defense, like the passing attack, and then their offense does what the other team can't do on defense. So I think this is another one of those matchups. Oregon needs to extend the drives, like Erik said, and they need to try to run the ball to set up Bo Nix for deep field passes like they've been doing all year.
All right, injuries. There's been some positives at the start of the week. Some of those turned into real good positives. Outlook looks good, like they'll play. And then others maybe still up in the air.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I think there's two guys that I don't expect to play, and that's Chase Cota, who we didn't see at practice all week, and Stephen Jones, who, despite Dan being kind of encouraging about on Monday, was not in pads either Tuesday or Wednesday, and didn't see an uptick. Like, I think Stephen is close. Like, this is by far, he hadn't been at practice until the previous week, and so him being out there at all was an encouraging sign, and him being in uniform was an encouraging sign, because we really hadn't seen a whole lot of that either. So I think he's getting close, but still not someone you expect to play. I expect DJ Johnson to play. I expect Taki Taimani to play, and I expect Jordan James and Alex Forsythe to play. All those guys were in full pads all week. DJ, I didn't really notice much of anything from. Taki had his ankle taped really well, or tightly, I should say. Forsyth didn't do all of the full contacty stuff we watched, but we get to see so little of it. It's hard to really say like how much he did during the full day. Like there was one kind of contact drill where they do combination blocks that he didn't do either day. I think he'll play. I don't expect him to be held out. He was in full pads. And then, I think Jordan James was probably held out for, I don't know what, but seemed to be, I didn't see any indication he was limited at all any of the days we were there. So I think all those guys will be available. I think Taki being able to play his former team is kind of an exciting kind of, opportunity for him. Unfortunately, it's a team that throws the ball a ton and he primarily plays on rundowns. So even if he is a little bit dinged up, I'm guessing he's only going to see the field probably like 8 to 14 maybe snaps anyway. So not going to be a huge workload, but I think Oregon's really close to being full strength, and which is a good sign because they've been without some key guys now the last couple of games.
Yeah, there's nothing else to add. I will note one quick thing. Taki Taimani is we talked to Keon Ware-Hudson after practice on Wednesday. And Keon mentioned that Taki has been wearing Washington gear underneath his Oregon, his football pads and stuff like that to piss the team off. So Keon says it's working. So I think I just thought that was fun, and there's no other injury news besides Coda and Stephen Jones. So
that's a ballsy move by Taki. Interesting, and I missed that. That's wild. I'm shocked that that's happening. Let's take a quick break while I process that. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on this prediction show on Friday. Hopefully your Friday is going well, or maybe it's Saturday morning and you're tailgating and you're getting yourself ready for this game. Time to dive into the predictions. Offensive team, offensive player, defensive team, defensive player, and then a score pick. I'll go first. I think Oregon's offense goes into Saturday's game averaging an impressive 7.16 yards per play. That number ranks 6th nationally. Their offense is elite. The Huskies this season have given up a season high of 7.74 against Arizona, and then they went for 6.93 yards per play against UCLA. Oregon has topped both of those numbers multiple times this season. They went for 8.1 at Washington State, 8.29 at Arizona, and then 7.81 at Cal. Knowing the talent that Oregon has on offense, knowing how good this offense is playing right now, and knowing what Washington has allowed against some similar offenses, I'm thinking Oregon hits 7.75 yards or more per play Saturday afternoon against the Huskies.
I think we're all thinking shootout, aren't we?
Yeah.
We'll get to score predictions later, but I think we think these offenses are both going to have some success. I mentioned the stat earlier where UCLA was the team to get closest to the 200-yard mark against Washington on the ground this year. They got to 185. I think Oregon will get to 200, and that'll be the first team against this Washington run defense to get there. I think Washington has it was notable when I was looking through. I do the 10 best recruits on the roster story every week, and you look at the top 10 on Washington. A lot of those guys are interior defensive linemen. I think 3 or 4 of their top 8 guys were. So they're not devoid of talent there, and the linebacking crew at Washington is certainly better than it was a year ago when it was very bad. I think Oregon will be able to have success, though, and I think we'll get to some individuals in a moment. But I just look at this matchup and think Kenny Dillingham has been so creative offensively as a play caller, and I think he just, especially in these big games, he's been up for the challenge and putting this team in really advantageous situations. And Bo Nix deserves credit for that as well because of the freedom he's given to make some changes at the line. But I just anticipate Oregon succeeding a lot on offense, and I think more than 200 yards on the ground.
I read your Scopodamus before this, and unfortunately, we have the same thing here. I think that they're going to go for 200 yards as well. UCLA had 184. I'd like to rescind my statement about Arizona State and their rush offense stinking because they had 156, third against Washington's defense this season. I think Oregon puts up the number 1. number one spot and with 200 yards. I don't think, like Oregon State ran the ball 40 times because it was a monsoon in Seattle, but I don't think it's going to be, barring an unforeseen weather circumstance here, I think Oregon is just going, like Erik said, be very creative with their rushing attack, figure out ways to get the ball to somebody in space, preferably Bucky Irving. I just think that this is going to be just an onslaught of rushing attack for Oregon here.
Offensive player pick. I think in either Oregon's biggest games, whether it's like matchup ranked versus ranked, or statistically speaking, Oregon's biggest offensive games, Bo Nix has been basically unstoppable. Against BYU, he rushed for 3 touchdowns. He ran for 2 more against Stanford. He had 3 against Arizona. And in the last 2 weeks, he's scored 3 touchdowns again, whether that's catching or rushing. And this doesn't account for passing touchdowns at all. And so when you factor in the passing element, I'm expecting Bo for the 6th time this season to hit 5 or more touchdowns total in this football game. I just feel like this is going to be one of those games that he's already in the discussion for the Heisman. I feel like his performance is going to really skyrocket himself up after this week. It's a 4 o'clock game. It's on Fox. It's a big network. I think he's gonna have a big game. And a lot of people, if they were on the fence of really going in on him as being a Heisman candidate, are going to be won over.
That's another one of those stats that's really impressive. We mentioned the 1 sack this year, but the fact that Bo has had 5 games already with 5 or more combined touchdowns, that's pretty dang impressive.
Ridiculous.
The season he's having is really special, and I know they are, but I hope Oregon fans are appreciating how this has gone, because this is statistically up there. Probably only competition you have is a couple of those Mariota seasons in terms of the best that an Oregon quarterback has had, and he's putting on a show. And I also think it continues this week. I didn't make a prediction here. This will surprise some listeners. I said Bucky was dead. I've revived him. He's back from the grave. I'm making a Bucky Irving prediction here. But I just want to say, because when I predict him doing good things, typically good things don't happen. At least he doesn't get to the rush total I predicted. But I am deviating a little bit from my old predictions of I always just would predict him 100 yards. I'm saying a career high rushing, receiving combined total. So it is different. So nothing to worry about. This will happen. Bucky will have a great game. I'm not jinxing him. I think he's going to, currently the career high was the 164 he had against UCLA, 107 on the ground, 57 receiving. I think he gets over 165 or more, I should say, on Saturday. Guy's been great in the big games and the big moments, obviously not Georgia, but ever since, I think he's played really, really well when the team has needed him. And they're going to need him this weekend. The offense is going to need to be firing on all cylinders. They haven't played an opposing offense that will put as much strain on them. Really, I think since Georgia, I know Washington State also scored a lot, but I think this is a game where you need Bucky to come through, and I think he will.
I think Bucky will come through as well, but not my prediction. I got Troy Franklin. I have him stepping up, just like Matt mentioned, where Nick seems to step up in all these big games where Oregon needs that person the most. I feel the same about Troy Franklin. I have Franklin getting over 130 yards through the air and at least 1 touchdown as well. He's Oregon's number 1 option. He was a little quiet last week against Colorado, but Oregon could have ran maybe their second string the entire game and still put up a similar score. So they didn't need him, and they needed him to come back from his injury or whatever that was against Cal and be 100% in order for this game, because this is when they're going to need him the most. Washington, Erik and I went over this at our Starbucks date with James Crepia after football practice, and Washington's secondary has allowed more passes over 30 or 40 yards this season than they have the last 3 seasons combined. Like Erik mentioned much earlier in the show, this is not a typical Washington secondary. And I think Oregon, with Bucky Irving's help setting up the ground game, is going to extrapolate and give them options down the field, and preferably to Troy Franklin, and make my prediction come true.
real quick, back to the offense real quick. Erik, you said Knicks is having a season very similar to Mariota, or only maybe closest to Mariota.
Yeah.
Knicks has 5 games this year with 5 total touchdowns or more. Mariota's career at Oregon had 7. So that just tells you how special it is. He's on another level. All right, defense of team pick. Week 1 against Georgia, the Ducks allowed 439 passing yards through the air. That's the most this season. And it's the most since week 2 at Ohio State, when the Buckeyes went, I think, for 484. I think Oregon's going to give up 440 or more passing yards in this game against the Washington Huskies. I don't think they're going to be very successful on the ground, but part of that's going to be because they're just so successful through the air. So Oregon's defense is not a good one this week. It's 440 more yards passing.
Matt, we did very similar, very, very similar predictions. I am also I explained this in my Skopil. When Oregon plays a bad opponent, I do a good defensive prediction. When Oregon plays a good opponent, I do a bad prediction, pretty much. I'm going slightly less on the total, but our predictions are the same general concept. I have 375 or more yards through the air for Washington, which isn't extremely bold considering they average 370. But the reason behind that figure being the choice was that the most Oregon has given up since Georgia was 374 against Cam Ward and Washington State. And actually, you look at it, I think this is kind of notable to just kind of put into perspective some of the pass stats for Oregon. You look at the starting quarterbacks and the numbers they've put up against Oregon this year in Pac-12 play. Nobody else besides Ward's thrown over 300 yards. They've had a couple that are in the mid 240, 250, 260 range, and then a couple under 200 yards. And I think part of the thing you have to recognize with those pass stats is how many of those have come late in games that were already decided, because like Jack Plummer threw for 214 yards, but Cal ended up with over 300 yards passing because they put the backup in. Same thing with Stanford. McKee had 166. They brought the backup in. He had some success. I just think you have to kind of that part needs to be sort of acknowledged. I'm not saying Oregon's defense is incredible against the pass, because that would be misleading, but I also think the stat itself might be slightly misleading when you look at it just at face value, because I do think a fair amount of these pass stats have been given up against like Oregon's second, third team defensive guys against backup quarterbacks, which isn't great, but sort of has to be distinguished against. So, but back to the point, 375 or more yards through the air for Penix.
This was a tough one. I didn't really know where to go with this, to be quite honest. I ended up favoring Oregon in this team defense statistics. Instead of an over, I have an under. I have Oregon holding Penix to under his season average in total yards per game, which is 362. I don't think that Oregon is going to stop Michael Penix Jr. I don't think they're going to come close. However, they're going to keep him under that number. And I think judging by how all of our predictions and what we've said earlier, we all think this will be a shootout. I concur. I think it'll be a nice little shootout here. I think it'll be a good Saturday game. I just think they're going to hold Penix under 362 even yards.
I think it's a reasonable approach. I don't think that's – I mean, Oregon's the better team on paper, and if they rise up the talent of their levels, they should be fine. They should be able to do that. That's not an out – I don't think that's a out there prediction. All right, defensive player pick. This is a positive one. There's going to be a lot of opportunities for it. I'm not saying Brian Addison with the interception, but I do think Triquez Bridges is going to haul in an interception at some point in this game, and it's going to prove to be pivotal for turning around a one-score game into potentially a two-score game.
A little bit of a redemptive arc there for Triquez. It's been an up and down season. I think actually PFF would tell you he's been pretty good. PFF would tell you that Triquez Bridges is like one of the better corners, not only on this team, but in the conference, which would surprise most people listening.
They would.
Again, PFF, I don't know what to make of it. Sometimes the figures don't make any sense. Sometimes they do. But but that's kind of part of the Tri-Quest thing. I like that one, Matt, because there'd be a little bit of a nice narrative feel to that of like, hey, this guy's gotten beat a couple times this year. Nice for him to make a play to maybe change a game. I'm going with Bennett Williams. I think this surprised me a little bit. It shouldn't have, because I should know the history, but this is the first time he's played Washington in his career. It's been here 3 years. 2020, they backed out of the game because of COVID, and then 2021, he was hurt. So he really talked about how he's been, champing at the bit to get in this one, to play in this rivalry. He knows how much it means. He's been around, and obviously in 2020, he got firsthand feel for how much Oregon doesn't like Washington, because he said that outcome and then the fact that Washington celebrated a division championship doesn't sit right with him. He said he wouldn't even recognize that as a division championship. He doesn't think the conference should either. But I think Bennett's going to have a lot of opportunities in this game. We talk about the success Washington could have, and I think we all expect to have throwing the football. I think Bennett's going to be around the ball quite a bit. And as Jared said, some of what they do is the equivalent of a run play in that it's not a very difficult completion. It's an underneath pass that the distance of the ball travels is not more than 5 to 6 yards downfield. And I think that's the area where Bennett can have a lot of success. So his also surprised me a little bit. A couple Bennett facts. His career high in tackles took place at Illinois his freshman season. In his 6th game, he had 14 against Minnesota. He's never had more than 8 at Oregon. So I think he's going to set a career high and get to double digits. So I think I'm going Bennett 10 or more tackles here. I'm not going to say leads the team, because I think a couple people could get a lot of tackles in the secondary, because that's where the ball is probably going to be located a lot. But I think Bennett has a nice day, and I know he's excited to get out there and play well. He talked about that quite a bit on Wednesday.
I also have a Bennett prediction. I did not copy Skopil dominance, but what I did do is I thought, well, Washington's going to throw the ball a lot. And for use of a better 2-word phrase or 3-word phrase, I think with Jamal Hill not being here, there's someone else is going to have to pick up the slack. And Bennett, I think, is one of Oregon's better open field tacklers. I think there's just, like Erik just mentioned, there's going to be a lot of balls just thrown in general, and he's going to be the best at coming downhill and tackling these guys who catch a 3 to 4 yard out route, a 3 to 4 yard crossing route. This secondary, I thought about a Tri-Quest Bridges prediction as well. This secondary is going to be tested. Bridges is going to be tested a lot. The linebackers are going to be tested a lot, and I wasn't going to be bold enough to put a linebacker prediction on my thing, but I got Bennett Williams over 8 tackles, so not quite 10, but over 8, which would be his Oregon career high.
By the way, has any of us landed a linebacker related defensive prediction this season?
Probably not, but I would assume you guys would have better luck, because my predictions, Bennett Williams is going to get a targeting call this week, because I'm 2 for 2 on those.
Oh no.
Yeah.
That's not good for Oregon. Hopefully it's in the second half, not the first half.
Well, I don't know when you want it to happen. Utah's I wouldn't.
Yeah, I just don't.
These are both.
I wouldn't want to get suspended here, or to get held out of half. That would be just brutal.
All right, score predictions. I don't see Oregon's offense really getting stopped much by Washington. I said that earlier. Very similar, comparing it very similar to how UCLA played out. I would bet on Penix making the bigger mistake than Nix in this game. The reason being, Washington hasn't played in a road game environment even remotely close to what they are going to face on Saturday. This season, their road games at UCLA, at Arizona State, at California prior to this game. The only one with even a remote kind of atmosphere was that UCLA game on a Friday night when, let's be real, the Rose Bowl was less than half full. And that was the best team that Washington has played up until this moment in time. And in that game, Penix put up good yardage, 345. He threw 4 touchdowns, but he threw 2 costly interceptions. And so I'm banking on that and the crowd environment factoring into this one. I think Oregon also gets a couple stops in the red zone or just before the red zone that forces UW to take field goals instead of touchdowns, which will feel like punts. But look, there's going to be a ton of points. There's going to be a ton of yards. This is going to be an old school Wild West shootout. And I think just Oregon makes just enough plays to steal a possession via an interception, a field goal stop to win this one 49-34. They cover, but by the slimmest of margins.
That's the exact score I was going to say. Literally, I was just in my head trying to pick between two scores, and I was like, yeah, we'll go with that because I was thinking, yeah, Oregon will probably hold them to a couple of field goals. Let's go with, yeah. I'm
sorry,
stunned.
I stole all your thunder. We don't share any of this.
No, we don't. As you can tell, that was genuine surprise. I'm just going to stick with I guess we're going to have the same score. That feels weird. Should I have the same? I shouldn't have the same score. I'll do. Boy, this is really throwing me for a loop here because I think Oregon's going to score touchdowns and Washington's going to kick field goals, but I don't really want to downgrade it any lower. I guess we could do 42-27. Let's do 42-27. Let's do a little lower scoring. I don't know about that.
Do that.
I think Washington's going to score.
I think they're going to score more than. Yeah, I think they're going to score.
But I don't really want to go over the 50 number. This is tough, Matt. You've made my life difficult here. Sorry for the live podcast deliberation because I had set up for a number, then you picked it.
I'm sorry.
All right, I'll give Oregon a field goal, and I'll give I'll give both teams an extra field goal. Let's go Oregon 52, Washington 37 for just a lot of points. There's more field goals than
there's a lot of points.
Camden Lewis gets his leg in action. Camden Lewis hasn't kicked a field goal since was at UCLA. He's going to kick a field goal. It's going to go in. They're going to win. Kind of outlined it all. Like I expect Oregon to obviously have a lot of success. The only reason I was hesitating, maybe going a little lower, is like there is a possibility where this gets to where they do just have a drive that takes like 9 minutes again, and they just 14J it all the way down the field, take up 7 minutes, 8 minutes of clock. That takes away more scoring opportunities. I think the weather is going to be pretty nice compared to some of the elements that they played in. Both teams played last week in really crappy weather. Oregon obviously wasn't impacted by it much. Washington clearly was. But I think this is going to be a game where we come away saying, man, we just watched two really good quarterbacks play close to their A games. It was a really fun game, lots of points, lots of scoring, lots of excitement. I think both teams get up and down the field throughout. I think Oregon's defense maybe makes a couple of plays to force those field goals, and they get out of there with a 52-37 win, which is just a massive score that I still feel weird about because I had another number in my head that Matt also had. So hopefully we're not mind melted too much.
Hopefully not. I've got Oregon winning 45-31. I think that's going to be. I think that's what I'm going to come up with because I agree with you guys. Like, I think there's going to be some field goals. I think this will be very similar to the UCLA game where like both teams first drive of the game potentially stall out, get a field goal, and suddenly 3-3, and all the over bettors are just not the happiest. But with the over at 72.5. 45-31 gets it comfortably done. Oregon barely covers as well on the spread of the 14-point victory. Like both of you guys, I just don't think that Oregon's really going to have too much trouble here on offense. I think Washington's defense is pretty good. I think obviously their rush defense has had good success against teams that don't really run the ball, which is what you would hope for. But Oregon, I think, is just going to be able to run the ball. I think that they'll be able to throw the ball when necessary. I think this is going to be a very traditional, what we have seen from Oregon in the last couple of weeks and the last couple of years, frankly, where they go ground and pound to start and then set up everything, all the deep balls, all the play action passes. Kenny Dillingham gets creative with it. The one issue that I worry about here, which I think should worry everybody who's an Oregon fan, is what happens if Oregon's secondary just cannot stop anything. And Washington just goes down the field, and even though they kind of dink and dump it a little bit with like 6 to 8 yard routes, what happens if they say, we can hit 15-yarders all day because we're going to go right over the middle. We're going to throw a ball 3 feet taller than Noah Sewell and Justin Flo and Jeffrey Bassa and Jackson LeDuc and get 15 yards every time. That's the one thing that would really worry me if I were a diehard Oregon fan and this becoming much closer than anticipated going into the game. But regardless, I don't think it happens. I think Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoi have something up their sleeve. I've got Oregon winning 45-31.
Real quick, from a betting perspective, Oregon has won against the spread 5 straight and 7 of their last 8.
And it would have been 7 straight if that damn Washington State touchdown at the end of the game didn't happen.
That's very true. And they've also hit the over 5 or 6 of their last 8 times. So they're covering, they're hitting the spread. And the flip side here, UW against the spread, they've lost 5
Miserable. Straight. They're terrible.
Yeah. So just some data points there to look at if you're betting on this game. Not telling you one way or another, but Oregon hits over and covers while UW does not. Certainly something to watch on that one as well. All right, that's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you for listening to the show. The next time you guys will hear from us is post-game from our houses Saturday evening, talking Oregon-Washington outcome and not predicting what happens. But until then, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.